New information now on the interviews with the former Attorney General Pam Bondi and a prison guard who was on duty the night Jeffrey Epstein died as part of this House investigation into Jeffrey Epstein. Our teams, listen, this is like tons of pages of documents here. We've got teams reading in on all of this. Remember, this is when Pam Bondi came in. She testified, answered questions behind closed doors for the Oversight Committee. So far, here's what we know. That Bondi told lawmakers that Epstein's co-conspirator, Ghislaine Maxwell, is a monster who should die in prison. As for who's to blame for the DOJ's much criticized handling of the Epstein files, Bondi told lawmakers she delegated oversight to all things Epstein to guess who? Her second in command at the time, Todd Blanche. We just talked about him 10 minutes ago. He's the guy that President Trump wants now to serve as the permanent attorney general moving forward if he is confirmed by the Senate. Remember, Bondi is the one who took a ton of heat for how she handled the Epstein files before she was fired by the president. I want to bring in Mel Zanona, who's live for us on Capitol Hill. Okay, Mel, talk us through it. I know, listen, this stuff just dropped 45 minutes ago, not even. What's in this transcript here, 100 plus pages?
All right, people, welcome back to Dr. John Podcast. In a since-deleted Truth Social post, Trump publicly demanded that Attorney General Pam Bondi prosecute his political enemies by name. James Comey, Adam Schiff, Letitia James, marking a dangerous shift in the relationship between the White House and the Justice Department. Legal scholars will examine this moment for decades as a president openly weaponizing the DOJ against his perceived adversaries. This specific moment captures something essential about the relationship that developed between Trump and his handpicked Attorney General, Pam Bondi. It was a relationship defined by pressure, by the president's expectation that the Justice Department would function as an extension of his political operation, and by an Attorney General trying to satisfy those demands while maintaining enough institutional legitimacy to actually function in the role. The dynamic that emerged from this contradiction produced some of the most consequential and alarming accountability questions.
Yeah, we are still digging through all of this. We had a lot dropped on us today. But two things that stood out to me, at least in the Pam Bondi transcript, was who she was and was not willing to talk about. She was more than willing to talk about Todd Blanche. In fact, his name came up 96 times, although some of those were from the questioners. But she repeatedly deferred key questions about how redactions were made and how files were produced on to Todd Blanche, which is a key part of this investigation. And that's also why Democrats came out of that deposition saying we need to hear from Blanche himself. Now, she was not willing to talk about her conversations with President Trump. She was pressed on reports that she had told the president his name does appear in the files, but when asked about that, she said she would not talk about her conversations with Trump. So again, we're still going through these latest transcripts. There's a lot to dig in here yet, but shedding some light on what investigators have been looking at over these past few weeks.
Mel, the Oversight Committee, we mentioned it's not just Pam Bondi. Can I just ask you this question, though, too? And I don't know if we know the answer to this, so forgive me, but Ghislaine Maxwell was very controversially moved to a different kind of prison. It has been derided by some as like a prison camp, essentially.
Of the entire Trump presidency, questions about how the Justice Department was directed, what cases were prioritized and why, what grand juries were convened and for whose benefit, and what happened to the Epstein files in the hands of a person who owed her position to the man whose name appears countless times in those files. The documented record of this relationship is specific and remarkable in its detail. Trump sent Bondi the now-deleted social media post demanding prosecutions of his enemies, calling her ineffective. Bondi advanced investigations aligned with Trump's political interests, including pushing a prosecutor to present evidence about the origins of the Trump-Russia probe to a grand jury. She may have violated federal rules governing grand jury secrecy by effectively confirming the existence of a grand jury in a public setting, an acknowledgement that legal analysts said crossed a legal line that federal prosecutors are not supposed to cross. And she shifted blame to her deputy, Todd Blanche.
Instead of the higher security prison that she was in previously as she's serving out her sentence, this was much derided by many Epstein survivors that I've spoken with, that I know you and your team have spoken with as well, going, what the heck? Why did this woman get moved? Why was she moved to a prison where she has arguably like a cushier lifestyle now? If in fact, that's why it's so interesting to hear Pam Bondi say she's a monster who should die in prison. If that's the case, why did they move her?
Yeah, she had said that in the deposition. She also had said that in a hearing publicly earlier this year. Unclear. We're still digging through this, so I'm not sure the exact answer to that, if she was asked about that and what she said. That's certainly something Democrats are very eager to learn about.
Okay, and let me ask you, too, about this, the other new allegations of abuse from a longtime assistant of Jeffrey Epstein's, because that is making some headlines today, too, right, Mel?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Sarah Kellen, a longtime assistant for both Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, she testified in front of the committee, and much of her testimony focused on the abuse she said she suffered at the hands of Epstein, but she also named 2 new people who she says abused her and that were associates of Epstein. That is Frederick Fekkai, he is a celebrity hairstylist, as well as Philip Levine, the former mayor of Miami Beach. Now, both of these men have denied any allegations of sexual assault through their spokesman, but the Oversight chair, James Comer, now calling on the DOJ to go ahead and investigate those men as well.
When the Epstein file controversy became politically untenable, claiming she only learned about a controversial Maxwell transfer from the news while simultaneously defending her overall conduct as an unprecedented commitment to transparency. That relationship, the pressure to weaponize, the partial compliance, the institutional damage, the eventual firing, the public praise masking private fury, is the nightmare grand jury confession scenario in its documented form, not a dramatic courtroom revelation that changes everything in an instant. The slow, grinding, publicly documented exposure of an attorney general caught between her institutional obligations and the political demands of the president who appointed her and who ultimately found her insufficiently useful.
We have a couple of big headlines out of the Justice Department this morning. President Trump is pushing his Attorney General, Pam Bondi, to punish his political enemies, saying, quote, "We can't delay any longer." Meanwhile, the Justice Department dropped an investigation into the president's border czar. New reports allege that Tom Homan accepted a cash payment from undercover agents. Scott McFarland is covering all of this. Scott, good morning.
Oh, Nate, it certainly has been a busy weekend at the U.S. Justice Department as the president ramps up pressure to move forward with cases against his high-profile political opponents.
President Trump had nothing but nice things to say about Attorney General Pam Bondi on his way to Arizona Sunday.
I think Pam Bondi is going to go down as one of the best attorney generals of the ages.
But over the weekend, he struck a different tone in a social media post asking her to do more to go after his political and legal rivals. In a direct appeal, Trump publicly pressed Bondi to file charges against his political adversaries, New York Attorney General Letitia James, former FBI Director James Comey, and California Senator Adam Schiff, adding, "We can't delay any longer. It's killing our reputation and credibility."
We have to act fast. If they're not guilty, that's fine. If they are guilty or if they should be charged, they should be charged. And we have to do it now.
It's an effort to try to silence and intimidate people.
The nightmare is not a single explosive moment. It is the accumulated record of what actually happened, the specific decisions made under specific pressure, and the specific consequences that those decisions have had for the institutional integrity of the Justice Department. To understand why the Bondi grand jury situation is as legally significant as it is, why it represents something more than ordinary attorney general controversy, you have to understand the specific legal framework governing grand jury secrecy and why a prosecutor's public acknowledgement of a grand jury's existence is a legal violation that carries serious professional and potential criminal consequences. Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure 6E governs the secrecy of grand jury proceedings with extraordinary strictness.
But I refuse to be silenced or intimidated.
This all comes amid the departure of Eric Siebert as top federal prosecutor in the Eastern District of Virginia, which the president claims was due to his unusually strong support from Virginia's 2 sleazebag Democrat senators. But there's concern Siebert was pushed out for not moving forward with prosecuting New York Attorney General James for alleged mortgage fraud after a months-long Department of Justice investigation involving a house she owns in Virginia. James has denied any wrongdoing. Lawmakers from both parties this weekend warned against the weaponization of the Department of Justice.
This is one of the most dangerous moments America has ever faced. We are quickly turning into a banana republic.
What they did to Donald Trump was an abomination. But yes, it is not right for the Trump administration to do the same thing.
A Republican attorney temporarily takes over that post in Virginia. The president says he'll nominate one of his personal attorneys, Lindsay Halligan, to take over the job for Senate confirmation. Halligan represented Trump in the classified records criminal case last year, which the Department of Justice eventually dropped. And Tony, she has no experience as a federal prosecutor.
Scott, there are questions also this morning about another case, this one involving the president's border czar, Tom Homan. What can you tell us about this?
Yeah, Tony, the FBI and Department of Justice officials confirmed they closed an investigation into Homan. MSNBC was first to report the FBI had recorded Homan.
The rule prohibits attorneys for the government from disclosing matters occurring before the grand jury, except in specific enumerated circumstances. And the list of those circumstances does not include a public statement by the Attorney General acknowledging the existence of a grand jury, because she is trying to defend her conduct before Congress. The reason for the strict secrecy rule is not bureaucratic formalism. Grand jury secrecy protects witnesses from retaliation, protects potential defendants from the stigma of investigation before charges are brought, and ensures the integrity of the investigative process by preventing targets from learning they are being investigated before charges are filed. When an attorney general effectively confirms the existence of a grand jury in a public setting, she is potentially undermining every one of those protections for the specific investigation involved, and she is doing so in a way that may itself violate the criminal statute that prohibits obstruction of investigations by prosecutors. The legal analysts who pointed out that Bondi may have crossed the legal line by acknowledging the grand jury were not making a partisan political argument. They were applying the specific legal framework that governs grand jury secrecy to the specific public statements Bondi made. The specific pressure campaign that Trump conducted against Bondi, the deleted Truth Social message demanding prosecutions of his political enemies, the private rage about all talk, no action, the eventual firing that came from frustration that she hadn't carried out his agenda on Epstein and other matters, reveals the specific nature of what he was demanding from the Justice Department, and why the distance between that demand and the institutional obligations of the office is so consequential. Trump was not asking Bondi to make prosecutorial judgments based on the evidence. He was asking her to make prosecutorial decisions based on his political enemies list. To use the power of federal prosecution to target specific individuals he wanted targeted, regardless of what the legal standards for prosecution required. That is a specific and documented form of abuse of executive power over the Justice Department that has the quality of the screaming threats the headline invokes. The public face of the relationship was praise. Trump called Bondi wonderful, praised her commitment to transparency, and publicly defended her performance. The private reality was demand, pressure, and eventual dismissal. He wanted specific outcomes from the Epstein file process and got a botched release that generated bipartisan outrage. He expected an attorney general who would execute his vision and got someone who was too constrained by the institutional requirements of the office to fully deliver. That specific gap between the expectation of unconditional political service and the reality of an institutional obligation that places some limits on what the office can be directed to do is the specific gap that generates the screaming threats dynamic. The headline is reaching toward the investigators and Oversight Committee members who have been questioning Bondi most aggressively about the grand jury issues and the Epstein file management. The Epstein files dimension of the Bondi story is the specific layer that gives the nightmare framing its most direct connection to the documented legal and political record. Bondi was the custodian of the most politically sensitive files in federal custody, files that by her own admission under congressional questioning contained Trump's name countless times. She made decisions about what to release from those files and what to redact. She provided curated binders of Epstein-related materials to conservative political influencers. She monitored which members of Congress were reading which sections of the unredacted files. And when the controversy over those decisions became intense enough that she needed to deflect responsibility, she told lawmakers that her deputy, Todd Blanche, was actually in charge of the entire release while simultaneously defending the release as an unprecedented commitment to transparency. The contradiction between claiming the release was unprecedented in its transparency and claiming she was not actually in charge of it is the specific contradiction that congressional investigators have been pressing her on. In the political context of that contradiction, the fact that the files whose management she is trying to deflect responsibility for are files that contain her boss's name countless times is the specific context that makes the grand jury confession frame so resonant even when the literal scenario of of a dramatic courtroom revelation has not occurred. The specific political dynamic of Trump's relationship with Bondi, publicly praising her while privately expressing fury, calling her wonderful in statements about her exit, while the reality was that he fired her because she hadn't carried out his agenda, is itself a revealing portrait of how the Trump political operation processes loyalists who fail to fully deliver on the expectation of unconditional service. The public praise is the political management tool, maintaining the appearance of a harmonious departure that does not suggest the kind of failure or conflict that would generate questions about what she was asked to do and whether she did it. The private fury is the actual assessment. The president who demanded prosecutions of his enemies and got all talk, no action, who wanted specific outcomes from the Epstein file process and got a botched release that generated bipartisan outrage, who expected an attorney general who would execute his vision and got someone who was too constrained by the institutional requirements of the office to fully deliver. That specific gap between the expectation of unconditional political service and the reality of an institutional obligation that places some limits on what the office can be directed to do is the specific gap that generates the screaming threats dynamic. The investigators and Oversight Committee members who have been questioning Bondi most aggressively about the grand jury issues and the Epstein file management are not in the most important sense investigating Bondi specifically. They are investigating the conduct of the Justice Department as an institution, asking whether the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country was directed in ways that serve the political interests of the president, who controls it, rather than the legal interests of the public it is supposed to serve. Bondi's specific decisions and Bondi's specific testimony are the specific evidence in that investigation. But the accountability question is larger than any individual attorney general. It is the accountability question that goes to the heart of what the Justice Department is and whether its institutional integrity can be maintained when the president who directs it is simultaneously a person with extensive personal legal exposure, political enemies he wants prosecuted, and sensitive files in federal custody that contain his name countless times. The grand jury that Bondi directed toward the origins of the Trump-Russia investigation is one of the most significant and least publicly examined elements of the entire Bondi DOJ story. The Trump-Russia investigation has been the subject of extensive legal scrutiny, multiple special counsel investigations, and years of congressional review. The conclusion of those investigations and reviews has consistently been that the investigation was properly predicated and properly conducted, that the FBI had legal and factual basis for opening the investigation, and that the investigators conducted it according to applicable rules and procedures. The specific decision to present evidence about the investigation's origins to a grand jury, to potentially pursue criminal charges against the investigators who conducted a legally predicated investigation, is the specific decision that critics described as the weaponization of the Justice Department for political purposes. And it is a decision that was made by an attorney general who had received specific communications from the president naming specific individuals he wanted prosecuted. The connection between the presidential demand and the prosecutorial action is exactly the kind of connection that critics of the department's conduct have been pointing to as evidence of political direction of prosecutorial decisions. The specific legal analysis of Bondi's potential grand jury secrecy violation is worth examining in detail because it illustrates the specific way in which the pressure to defend herself publicly before Congress created a legal conflict with the institutional obligations of the Attorney General's role. When Bondi was being questioned by congressional investigators about specific DOJ decisions and specific prosecutorial actions, she had a political incentive to provide context and explanation that would defend her record and deflect the most damaging accusations. But the specific information she needed to provide to mount that defense, information about what investigations were underway, what grand juries had been convened, what evidence was being presented to those grand juries, is exactly the category of information that Rule 6E prohibits her from disclosing. The Attorney General who is testifying before Congress in defense of her own conduct is in the same legal position as any other government attorney who is subject to Rule 6E secrecy obligations. Her institutional position does not grant her an exemption from the rules that govern attorney conduct with respect to grand jury secrecy, and the specific statement she made that legal analysts characterized as potentially crossing the legal line were statements made in the specific context of congressional testimony, where the political pressure to defend her record conflicted with the legal obligation to maintain grand jury secrecy. That is the specific mechanism through which the grand jury confession framing finds its legal grounding even without a dramatic, voluntary disclosure. The pressure to defend herself created the conditions for the potential violation, and the potential violation itself became another element of the accountability picture that investigators are assembling. The role of Todd Blanche in the Bondi story is another dimension that reveals something important about how the Trump DOJ managed responsibility for its most controversial decisions. Blanche, before becoming Bondi's deputy, was Trump's personal criminal defense attorney, the lawyer who represented him in the hush money trial and in other criminal matters. His appointment to the senior DOJ position by the president he had been representing was itself a remarkable concentration of personal loyalty in an institution that requires independence from presidential political interest to function credibly. When Bondi told congressional investigators that Blanche was actually in charge of the entire Epstein file release, a claim that was both a specific deflection of responsibility and an implicit acknowledgement that the person in charge was someone with an exceptionally direct personal connection to the president, whose name appears countless times in the files, she was revealing something specific about how the DOJ under her leadership was organized and who was actually making the decisions about the most politically sensitive materials in federal custody. Whether or not the specific factual claim about Blanche's responsibility was accurate, the revelation that Trump's former personal criminal defense attorney was in a senior role, managing the release of files that contained Trump's name countless times, is itself a data point about the institutional independence of the DOJ under Bondi's leadership. The congressional questioning of Bondi about all of these issues, the Epstein files, the grand jury, the Trump-Russia probe origins, the Blanche role, represents one of the most sustained and most extensive oversight investigations of a Justice Department official in recent memory. The questions being asked are not partisan fishing expeditions looking for anything that might be embarrassing. They are specific, factual questions about specific decisions that had specific legal and institutional consequences. The investigators have documents, they have testimony from other witnesses, they have the legal framework of what the rules actually require. And they are pressing Bondi on specific contradictions between what the rules require and what the documented decisions reflect. That is oversight functioning as it is supposed to function, not as political theater, but as the serious institutional examination of whether the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country was directed in ways that compromise its institutional obligations to the public interest. The broader picture of what Bondi's tenure reveals about the Trump DOJ is one that Democrats and legal experts have been framing as a systematic bending of the Justice Department's institutional framework to serve Trump's political interests. The cases advanced at Trump's political direction. The files managed in ways that appear to protect politically sensitive information. The grand jury secrecy rules potentially violated in the course of defending DOJ conduct before Congress. The appointment of a former personal attorney to a senior role overseeing the most sensitive materials in federal custody. Each of these elements taken individually might be explainable as poor judgment or bureaucratic failure. Taken together, they form a pattern that critics argue reflects not individual error, but a systematic orientation of the institution toward serving Trump's political interests rather than the public interest the institution was created to serve. The specific emotional and political dynamic of Trump's relationship with Bondi, alternating between public praise and private fury, his demands for prosecutions of his enemies, his frustration that she wasn't executing his vision fast enough, his eventual dismissal accompanied by public statements about what a wonderful person she is one of the most revealing portraits of how Trump manages the senior officials in his administration and what the specific consequences are for the institutional roles those officials hold. hold when a president publicly demands that his attorney general prosecute his political enemies and privately expresses fury that she isn't doing it fast enough. He is not making a legal judgment about whether the evidence supports prosecution. He is making a political demand that the institutional framework of the Justice Department is supposed to protect against. And when the attorney general partially complies with that demand, advancing investigations at his political direction, managing sensitive files in ways that appear to serve his interest, while also trying to maintain enough institutional legitimacy to function in the role, she is caught in the specific conflict that the nightmare framing is describing. The nightmare is not a single dramatic betrayal, but the accumulated record of a Justice Department operating at presidential political direction. An attorney general who received specific demands to prosecute enemies, directed grand jury investigations accordingly, potentially violated grand jury secrecy rules, and managed the Epstein files to protect the president's interests, yet still got fired for not executing Trump's vision fully enough. Even a loyalist attorney general runs up against institutional limits, and the public record of that failure, the gap between what Trump demanded and what Bondi could deliver, is itself a form of accountability. The documented facts will outlast the administration. Trump publicly praised Bondi while privately expressing fury that she wasn't executing his vision. Bondi publicly defended her record while shifting blame to deputies and potentially violating the rules governing her conduct in the course of mounting that defense. Congressional investigators are assembling the documented record of what actually happened case by case and decision by decision, and the accountability picture that is emerging from that assembly, even without a dramatic courtroom confession, even without a single explosive revelation that changes everything overnight, is a nightmare portrait of institutional corruption in its most specific and most documented form. The nightmare is not what might happen next. The nightmare is what already happened. And the grand jury that Bondi directed toward Trump's political enemies, the grand jury whose existence she may have illegally confirmed in the course of defending her own conduct, the Epstein files whose management she is trying to deflect responsibility for, are all part of the documented record of what that nightmare looks like in its institutional form. The screaming threats are documented in the Truth Social posts, the private fury that leaked through the public statements, the demands for prosecution by name of specific political enemies. The nightmare is real in the specific decisions that were made, the grand juries that were convened, the files that were managed in ways that served political interests rather than the public interest. And the confession, not to a court, but to the public record, is being assembled one hearing and one document at a time. The congressional investigation of Bondi's conduct has been relentless and detailed, pressing her on specific contradictions between what the rules require and what the documented decisions reflect. The investigators have been building a case that does not depend on a dramatic voluntary admission, but on the accumulation of specific documented facts that collectively paint a devastating picture of an attorney general who compromised the institutional integrity of the Justice Department in service of presidential political interests. The specific contradictions in Bondi's testimony have been particularly revealing. She claimed the Epstein file release was unprecedented in its transparency, while also claiming she wasn't actually in charge of the release. She defended her overall conduct as exemplary while shifting specific responsibility to her deputy for the most controversial decisions. She acknowledged the existence of a grand jury in public testimony, while the rules governing grand jury secrecy prohibit exactly that kind of acknowledgement. These contradictions are not simply inconsistencies in a witness's memory. They are evidence of an attorney general trying to simultaneously defend her conduct and deflect responsibility for it, trying to claim credit for transparency while avoiding accountability for the specific decisions that generated controversy. The investigators have been pressing these contradictions precisely because they reveal something fundamental about how the Justice Department was actually being run under Bondi's leadership. The broader implications for the Justice Department's institutional integrity are devastating and will last long after Bondi has left office. The department's credibility, its ability to bring prosecutions that the public and the courts will treat as legitimate exercises of law enforcement authority rather than as political operations, depends on the perception that prosecutorial decisions are made based on evidence and law rather than on the political interest of the sitting president. Every decision Bondi made at Trump's political direction direction. Every case advanced because Trump wanted it advanced rather than because the evidence supported it. Every file managed in ways that appeared to protect Trump's interests rather than the public's interest in transparency, eroded that institutional credibility in ways that will be felt in specific DOJ cases for years. Defendants who were prosecuted at Trump's political direction will have their lawyers arguing that the prosecution was politically motivated. Cases that were advanced or not advanced based on political considerations rather than legal merit will face credibility challenges that would not exist if the institutional independence of the department had been maintained. The nightmare is not just the specific conduct that has been documented. It is the institutional damage that the documented conduct has done, and that will continue to manifest in the specific cases that the compromised institution was supposed to handle with integrity. That is the longest lasting and most consequential dimension of the nightmare. The damage to the department's reputation will not be repaired simply by Bondi's departure. It will require years of sustained effort by future attorneys general to rebuild trust in the institution's independence and professionalism. The specific connection between the Bondi story and the broader accountability movement in Washington is significant and revealing. The investigations of Bondi's conduct are not isolated events. They are part of a larger pattern of accountability efforts that have been building in response to Trump's systematic efforts to politicize federal law enforcement. The contempt findings against administration officials who refused to comply with congressional subpoenas, the court rulings that rejected executive privilege claims, the legislative efforts to protect the Justice Department from political interference, all of these are part of the same accountability infrastructure that has been examining Bondi's conduct and the conduct of the department under her leadership. The Bondi investigation is a specific manifestation of a broader institutional response to the threat of politicized law enforcement. The legal precedents that are being established through the Bondi investigation will shape how future attorneys general understand their obligations and how future presidents understand the limits of their authority over the Justice Department. The rules governing grand jury secrecy are being tested and clarified. The limits on prosecutorial discretion in politically sensitive cases are being examined. The relationship between the White House and the Justice Department is being redefined through the specific accountability mechanisms that have been deployed in response to Trump's conduct. These precedents will outlast the specific political conflicts that generated them and will be part of the institutional framework that future administrations, regardless of party, will have to operate within. That is the enduring significance of what is happening now. The final thing to understand about the Bondi story is what it tells us about the long-term institutional cost of using the Attorney General as a political operative rather than as an independent law enforcement official. The Justice Department's institutional credibility depends on the perception that prosecutorial decisions are made based on evidence and law rather than on the political interest of the sitting president. When that perception is undermined, the department's ability to fulfill its core mission of enforcing the law fairly and impartially is compromised. The cases that the department brings will be viewed with suspicion. The investigations it conducts will be seen as politically motivated. The legitimacy of its actions will be questioned in ways that undermine the rule of law itself. This is not a partisan concern. It is a concern for anyone who believes that the country needs a Justice Department that can be trusted to enforce the law without regard to politics. The Bondi story is a case study in institutional vulnerability, whether the Justice Department's safeguards can withstand a president who views it as his personal instrument. The evidence shows those safeguards can be bent, and the accountability challenge is to strengthen them for the future. The emerging public record of what Bondi did and why will be studied for generations. A cautionary tale about an attorney general who prioritized political loyalty over institutional independence, with the truth building in the public record despite all efforts to suppress it.